Columbus with us. He's no stranger to a lot of us. He's a lieutenant commander of the SD Lee camp there in Columbus, in Caledonia, Mississippi. History professor, director of McCormick Civil War Institute, Shenandoah University, Winchester, Virginia. His last two books is The Battle of Oklahoma, which he talked to us about, and his new publication, The Holly Springs, Van Dorn's Raid on Holly Springs, both from the state of Mississippi Cinquentennial Reading List. At this last, our SCV state meeting, he was also awarded the General William P. McLean Publication Award for the Battle of Oklahoma, Defended Mississippi Prayer book, which we're proud of. He also said that his offer to show us around Oklahoma still stands, but we will just wait till it's about 30 degrees cooler. But we're still going to take him up on that offer someday.
Can I bring my medal?
We definitely have to wait till it's cooler. So without much more to do, I'd like to bring y'all a round of applause for Dr. Brandon Beck.
With the young men I spoke to hand out the handouts, distribute those. I didn't bring enough, I can see that. I brought 25, so maybe some of y'all can share. And most of the geography will be familiar to you anyway. This is my second time here, and I hope it's not my last. And I would just repeat to the visitors that if you're interested in joining an SCV camp, you have a hard time finding a better camp than this. Every time I come here, I'm made to feel instantly welcome, and I learn something every time I come here. Mark took me up today to see General Lowry's grave, and chill when I'm back looking at such a beautiful place up there, and he was such an important, great man. So I love coming here. If you have the opportunity to join, I strongly recommend that you do. I asked Mark to mention the McCain Award because it's named for William McCain, who was a great friend of the SCV and also a major force in making Southern Mississippi a great university. And the SCV has to be all about education. Education has to be first and foremost for us. It's our future, and it's the fulfillment of the pledge we made to SCV to keep alive the good name of the Confederate soldier and the virtues for which he stood. The title of my talk is Old Man River and Earl Van Dorn. And it's based on my Holly Springs book. But I set out to write a book about Van Dorn's raid on Holly Springs, Christmas time in 1862. And as I got into it, I found that I couldn't make any sense out of it, couldn't make any historical sense out of it, unless I got across the point, I had to get across myself first, that Van Dorn saved Vicksburg twice in 1862. In the summer of 1862, it was Earl Van Dorn behind the construction and the great voyage of the incredible ship, the CSS Arkansas. And then at Christmas time, 1862, he saved Vicksburg again with his raid on Holly Springs. I know you all like your speakers to go about 30 minutes, no more than that. I can't do both of those stories justice in that time. I feel like I can barely do the CSS Arkansas justice in that time. So what I'm going to try to do is mention some of the highlights of the story of the Arkansas, that great Confederate ship. You all have heard Tom Parsons, great historian, talk about the Holly Springs raid. I hope I come back here. I hope I'll be invited back to do a follow-up on the Holly Springs raid, get my take on it, to go along with Ranger Parsons. Best part of it, these are two great stories, the ship and the raid. To understand, to get the full impact of any great story, you need to know a little bit of the background. The background for the CSS Arkansas is Old Man River and Earl Van Dorn. They tie the two stories together. They tie the Arkansas and the raid together. We all know Old Man River. most of us know, what most people know about Earl Van Dorn is that he was shot to death by a jealous husband in Spring Hill, Tennessee on the 7th of May, 1863. I think it's too bad that most people know Van Dorn for Spring Hill rather than for Holly Springs. The truth of the matter is that Earl Van Dorn, as I say, saved Vicksburg twice in 1862. We couldn't save it at all in 1863. We lost in 1863, plus the Army defending 35,000 men. But Van Dorn fended off two separate attempts to take Vicksburg in 1862. And the first was with the CSS Arkansas. Well, what's so important about Old Man River? His importance to the north was a little bit different than his importance to us. To the north, he was the outlet for Midwestern grain coming down the Mississippi and out into the Gulf of Mexico. To the north, New Orleans was an invaluable, got-to-have-it station for the West Gulf Blockading Squadron, Farragut's squadron. To the north, the Mississippi River was an avenue of invasion. Controlled the Mississippi River, and the north could attack. I'll take them in alphabetical order: Corinth, Jackson, Meridian, Vicksburg, all vulnerable from the Mississippi River. Just as important, invasion route leading west. If you look at your map, if you're lucky enough to get one of the maps, on page 1, you can see the Red River emptying into Mississippi well below Vicksburg. The Red River leads a Union Army into the most valuable, single most valuable source of Confederate supplies for the whole war, for the whole Confederate States of America: Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas. They were our source of cattle, horses, salt, men, and even arms. And a supply trail that stretched clear down into Mexico and came up to the Mississippi River. Now, in a minute, I'll explain how things got across the Mississippi and what happened to them next. But those are the reasons why the river was so important to the north. For us, the river has a little bit of a different importance. We needed the mouth of the river to get Mid-South, Deep South cotton out. For them, it was Midwestern grain. For us, it was getting cotton out into the wider world. But more than that, it wasn't so much for us the river as it was places on the river. And 3 places stand out for us on the river: Memphis, New Orleans, and Vicksburg. What made those 3 places important was, and there were no bridges across the Mississippi for those supplies to move over, but there are some places on the Mississippi it's easier to cross than at other places. Memphis, New Orleans, and Vicksburg were such places. And if, in addition to being able to cross the Mississippi, get salt, horses, cattle, men, arms across the Mississippi, those places, if you had a railroad connection waiting for you on the east bank to move all of those goods, all that valuable military material, if you had a railroad connection waiting on you to get that to the armies in the east, or even to the armies defending Atlanta, Chattanooga, that magnifies the importance of those places. Now, in the spring of 1862, Admiral Farragut's West Coast Blockading Squadron took New Orleans. That's lost to us without a fight. Largest city in the South, one of the 3 places that's got railroad connections to the east, and supplies can cross over from the west. 6th of June, 1862, the Upper Mississippi River Fleet, Union Fleet, took Memphis. That left Vicksburg alone as by now the essential link in a line of supply that runs clear back to Mexico. Can cross the river at Vicksburg and then get on one of the few first-class railroads in the South, the line running from Vicksburg to Jackson, and then on from Jackson to Meridian, Mobile, or on towards Chattanooga by way of Tupelo. Now, in addition to being a link, this is the important thing. This is what I didn't understand when I started out doing
book, but this wasn't clear to me. Every Civil War book in the world talks about how important Mississippi was and how important Vicksburg was, but don't really get down to explaining why it was so important. Vicksburg, by the middle of the summer of 1862, was that essential link and that essential supply chain that I mentioned. But in addition to being a link, Vicksburg was also a barrier. Vicksburg is a barrier to anything coming down the river from Memphis or coming up the river from New Orleans. Those guns on those high bluffs overlooking the river, the thought was that they could stop anything in the river dead in its tracks. There was nothing going to bypass the guns in Vicksburg. The course of the river was different then. Big U-turn, almost a U-turn there, slowed ships down to a crawl, left them vulnerable to those guns up there. So Vicksburg is a barrier as well as a link. And it's obviously got to be held. Lincoln knew it, Farragut knew it, that it had to be taken. And in the spring of '62, Lincoln turned the United States Navy loose on it. After Farragut took New Orleans, his ships, now these are ocean-going, tall, masted, men of war. Mississippi River, never seen the likes of these ships. Those ships came up the river, blithe as larks, demand the surrender of Natchez, down comes the flag. Demanded the surrender of Baton Rouge, down comes the flag. Vicksburg was a different story. They sent word into Vicksburg, Captain Andrew Phillips of the USS Oneida, I think it was, sent word into Vicksburg, your surrender is demanded, and we'll, the usual lingo, 12 hours, 3 hours to consider, and so forth. The 3 answers came back. One was from the mayor, but they all said no. But one was from the mayor of Vicksburg, who was probably a good friend of Jefferson Davis. The other was from the post commander, Martin Luther Smith, who was also the engineer that placed all those guns on the heights up there. And the third came from a lieutenant named James Autry, who was from Holly Springs. His reply was the most memorable. He wrote his note to the Union captain. These words always make the hair on the back of my head stand up. He wrote, Mississippians do not know how to surrender and refuse to learn. Well, I wondered about Autry, and it turns out that he was killed in the Battle of Murfreesboro 3 days after Van Dorn raided into Holly Springs, December 29th, 1862, and visited his tomb, his grave, in the cemetery of Holly Springs. You come to find out that he was so bad at surrendering because it ran in the family. His father had been in the Alamo. His father knew about not surrendering. It stayed in the family. Well, Jefferson Davis was most encouraged in Richmond by those words of Autry's and knew that words were all very fine, but that he was going to need a good general officer to entrust someone good to entrust the defense of Vicksburg to. I'd like to say that Earl Van Dorn was his first choice, but it wasn't. Earl wasn't. Earl was his third choice. Earl Van Dorn, born in Fort Gibson, he was a Mexican War hero. And he did great things in Texas when Texas was pulling out of the Union. He had a very up and down military record, even by 1862. He was the president's third choice. He got to Vicksburg on the 22nd of June. He took a look at what he was facing in Vicksburg and came to these conclusions. He decided, first of all, that there was going to be no surrender. He knew that. He knew Vicksburg wasn't going to surrender. And he knew, secondly, that the Navy by itself, they could bombard Vicksburg from now until Kingdom Come, but Vicksburg wasn't going to surrender. The bombardment wasn't going to bring the flag down. But he knew this, and this is the thing. This is the strategic sense that he had. This is another thing that I didn't fully understand until I got into it. Van Dorn realized that as long as now by the time he gets there are 2 Union fleets in the water bombarding Vicksburg. Farragut's from New Orleans, and Charles Davis fleet has come down from Memphis, about 50 ships out there. Van Dorn understood that as long as those ships are out there, they have accomplished their purpose. With those ships sitting out there, Vicksburg can't be a barrier, and Vicksburg can't be a link. And they have accomplished they don't need Vicksburg to surrender. All they need to do is to be able to stay down there underneath those guns in the river, lobbing shells into Vicksburg, and Vicksburg is as good as surrendered as far as they're concerned. So he understood that he was going to have to get a defense that would do more than hold out. He was going to have to get a defense coordinated between the garrison along the landing and the gunners on the bluffs, and he was going to have to get help on the river itself. Where is he going to find that help? At the beginning of the war, the Confederate government commissioned 4 big ironclads to the Mississippi River. The CSS Louisiana and the CSS Mississippi were under construction at New Orleans. Lieutenant Isaac Brown was the commander of the Naval Yard. His name will come up again in a minute. Louisiana and the Tennessee were under construction in New Orleans. They both had to be destroyed when the city fell. When Memphis fell, there were 2 ships under construction there. One near the finish, one just begun. Near the finish was the CSS Tennessee. And we had to blow that up to keep it from falling into federal hands. But here's the miraculous thing. Some kind of way, the Navy people in Memphis got the CSS Arkansas out of there in time. Now, the CSS Arkansas at that point was essentially a barge with a scow boat coming on behind it, carrying all the railroad tracks that would be used to iron plate to give the thing its ironclad definition. Somehow they got that ship out, that barge, and they towed it down the river to the mouth of the Yazoo. And then they towed it up the Yazoo River to Greenwood, where it was placed under command of Lieutenant Isaac Newton Brown, the commander of the Naval Yard at New Orleans. President Davis told Brown to spare no expense and lose no time in getting that ship completed. And Brown set to work. He moved the ship, such as it was, to Yazoo City, where there were some shipbuilding facilities for the steamboat landing. The scow carrying the armor had sunk, so challenge number 1 was getting it off the bottom of the Yazoo River. The difficulties were just incredible that he faced. It just staggers the imagination to realize what he went through. But Van Dorn knew that he was a good man. And Van Dorn's first request from Vicksburg to President Davis, once he got there to take up command of the defense, was to put that ship and Lieutenant Brown under my authority rather than under the authority of the Navy Department in Richmond. President Davis assented to the request. And from day 1, Van Dorn put tremendous pressure on Brown, and Brown put tremendous pressure on the workers that he had to get that ship finished. Brown had to get the iron off the bottom of the Yazoo River. He had to find someone that could make gun carriages. Carpenters skilled enough to make gun carriages. This ship is going to carry 10 heavy guns. I'll give you the statistics in just a minute. But it's going to carry 10 heavy guns, and the gun carriages are formidable pieces of work. He's got to find a crew. He's got to find a crew for this thing. It'll take a crew of 200 men. And he's got to fabricate engines for this ship. Pumps to get water to the boilers. For the coal. It's a steam power thing. He's got to get engines, crew, every single thing. By the second week in July,
The ship was as ready as it was going to be, Brown said. These are the statistics. 165 feet long, 35 foot at the widest, had a draft of 11 and a half feet, armored all over with railroad iron. There wasn't a rolling mill of Confederacy to turn plate to ironclad the ship. They had to take up railroad tracks and get the railroad tracks in the flat plane together. Reinforced by a foot of oak, the armor at a 35-degree angle, 10 heavy guns, crew of 200 men, 2 engines, developed 900 horsepower, capable of good speed, but most unreliable. The best thing you can say about the engines was that they were day to day. Well, Van Dorn wanted the ship to come down the Yazoo River, out into the main channel. Wanted it to fight its way through 50 Union ships and get in under the protective fire of the guns above Vicksburg, where it would become a part of the defense of the city. And then there's an additional feature that I'll get to. But down the river they came. They met 3 Union ships coming up the Yazoo. Sank one, ran another aground, chased the 3rd one back to the mother fleets. Some kind of way achieved total surprise. Captain Brown, Lieutenant Brown, when he rounded Eagle Point to come out into the main channel of the Mississippi, he described what he saw. He said, I had the feeling that we were sailing into a forest. And what he meant by forest were the masts and the riggings of between 45 and 50 ships. And there was nothing for it, he said, but to follow orders and go through. Most of the accounts of what the Arkansas went through describe it as a gauntlet, that they had to run down between Farragut ships on the one side and Davis ships on the other. But Brown said it wasn't a gauntlet. He said, I had the distinct feeling the whole way that we were surrounded. To put it in a modern analogy, the Arkansas was like a running back moving the pile all the way into Vicksburg. Brown put it a little differently. He said, we were surrounded. The advantage was ours. We could fire without fear. It was right. We could fire without fear of missing an enemy or hitting a friend. They could not. Wow. It met. Yeah. They came in, Van Dorn and Breckinridge and their staffs were up at the top of the courthouse, Cupola Courthouse in Vicksburg. And as they came in, Van Dorn and Breckinridge clattered downstairs and ran down to the landing, went aboard the ship. Both Van Dorn and Breckinridge have seen a lot of war, professional soldiers. They've seen, war's not 2 years old, and they've seen terrible things. But they wrote they had never seen anything as terrible as the interior of the Arkansas. No Union shell or ball had penetrated, but many were wedged in there. Whenever any one of those balls hit, the men inside suffered severe concussive damage, and many of them were thrown around on the inside, loss of limbs, loss of life. Terrible to say it, but of course, when they went into action, Brown had the decks strewn with sand to absorb the blood, and they said that there wasn't enough sand. There couldn't have been enough sand for it. But the ship overcame odds of 1 to 45, or 1 to 50. And once under the guns at Vicksburg, Brown wrote that over the next 10 days, all I had to do was to raise steam.
if I raised steam and had smoke coming out of the stack, all of those 45 ships up there likewise had to raise steam. When I saw them raising steam, I banked my fire. I had no intention of going out. But they can't do that forever. They can't go on like that forever. One was in control of 45 to 50 at that point. And on the 28th of July, Farragut said enough of this, took his ships back to New Orleans. And Davis likewise took his ships back to Memphis. And Vicksburg had been saved. I wish the story had a happy ending. If a story like this, if happy is the right word. But Van Dorn believed that having saved Vicksburg, if he could take Baton Rouge back, they would have created a 250-mile length of the river that would be a free crossing zone, so to speak, for all those trans-Mississippi supplies coming his way. He believed that the Arkansas could assist General Breckinridge in taking back Baton Rouge and coordinated land and river attack on the place, on the capital of Louisiana. The Arkansas's engines were not up to it. Between Vicksburg and Baton Rouge, the ship's engines failed 5 times. The last time with Yankee vessels approaching, and the crew, Brown was not there. Crew with witnesses he wrote about it said that the officers in command, with tears in their eyes, prepared the ship for scuttling. All the powder was taken out of the magazines, fuses were set, crew got ashore, and the ship pushed out into the main stream, and coming to a fiery and terrible end. The ship had not lived more than 2.5 weeks, but it's one of the most incredible sagas in Confederate history. And it's not just an isolated incident. It's not just as heroic as it is, it's not just an isolated incident. It was the salvation of Vicksburg. It shows the Northern government that the Navy can't take Vicksburg. It's going to have to be a big land operation. And that, of course, comes with Grant in 1863. Grant's first operation against Vicksburg, the same Earl Van Dorn turned it back with his raid on Holly Springs, which I hope is what I talk to you about next time. When Vicksburg finally did surrender on the 4th of July, 1863, Van Dorn had not lived to see the surrender of the city that he had defended so well. A jealous husband had shot him to death in his own office in Spring Hill, Tennessee, on the 7th of May. That was 3 days before the death of Stonewall Jackson, and Van Dorn's death was completely overshadowed by that event. Thank you very much. Yeah, if anyone would like to get the book, I'd be happy to sign the books. I've got one copy of the Oklahoma book, which is being reprinted